So today I'm going to be talking about being open and transparent, which may be a phrase that you've used before or you've heard that someone else use, but it's used a lot. But what does it actually mean? So there's lots of different definitions. This is the one I found with a bit of research online. So working in the open is the act of both good and bad information being shared upward, downward, and laterally in a way that allows all to see the why behind the words, which sounds like a very fancy definition, but if you break that down, it's really just kind of not having any secrets, having open and honest communication with the people you're working with or for, and just because then that can help create trust and understanding. So I'll go into some examples of this later on. So if you're working on a piece of work, there's often no reason why you shouldn't be open about some of the problems you might be facing or things that are happening, because otherwise you can end up working in the dark or in silos, because not everyone is engaging in the piece of work, or it might feel like people are having stuff done to them instead of being supported or being part of whatever piece of work or project is going on. So overall, it's about building open and honest relationships with communication. That's sort of the kind of underlying aim behind working in the open. So one of the things you can do to help with this, you may have been to some, there might be some going on as part of service this week that you're signed up to go to, is a show and tell. And you may think just from the name show and tell, it's also called show and share as well. It's kind of like being back at school and someone bringing in something to talk about, but it has a slightly different meaning, although it's very similar in terms of the workplace. It's basically about presenting and showing what you've been working on. And I know that can sound like it's very much, oh, yeah, look at me, look what I've been working on, aren't I great? But it's not like that at all. It's about having a feedback and having a two-way conversation with everyone to be like, this is what I'm working on. What does everyone think about it? Is there anything I may have missed? All those sorts of questions of why show and tells are so important, especially when doing digital or design work or even project work. So a definition of a show and tell is a practice of showing something to an audience and then telling them about it, which again does sound obvious, but it's a great example of working in the open and being transparent, because it will make everyone feel like one team, and it will mean that everyone can work together, know what's going on, and talk about it without feeling like they're out overstepping or they don't know enough about what's going on. So I've touched on it briefly, but why do you do show and tells? Why do you work in the open like this? It can help pieces of work be more focused. It can, like I said, it can improve the collaboration because people will understand more, and it encourages more of a transparency between the people working on the piece of work and maybe the people who will be impacted by it. It can encourage the audience to go and see for yourself, and it also means you can just develop relationships with people that maybe you might not have had that connection before, but they might turn up and actually raise some interesting questions, so then you can get them more involved in whatever you're working on. There's lots of different kind of things you could talk about as part of a show and tell. So you could talk about the benefits of something that you've discovered. You can just show what you've been working on if you've got a prototype or like a form or something that you've got to actually show. You could talk about the journey that you've been on, so how it started and where you've ended up where you are now. You can talk about lessons learned, things you may have learned during the piece of work. And one that's used a lot is the good, the bad, and the ugly, or like a retrospective where you can talk about, so this worked, this didn't work, and we're going to improve on this. You said, we did sort of method. And it's really important as part of that to make sure that you're not just showing across to kind of the smaller team that you work with or your own team. You've got to share across all these different organizational boundaries to anyone and everyone that you want to see, really. And anyone who can see should be seeing what you're working on, and you should be showing and telling about it. Again, because there might be those connections that you don't know of, and also a lot of time, if something's going on in the dark, people are going to start making up assumptions or saying, oh, I think this is what's happening, when it's much easier just to come out and in front and be transparent about what actually is happening. This is key when presenting, but it's also key when doing a show and tell, is just to be yourself. They've come to hear about the piece of work, but they've also come to hear from you. So they're not expecting some hardened presenter, just someone who's going to get the information across. And it's much easier and much better to connect with someone when they're just being themselves, instead of trying to kind of put on this facade over the top. So another thing you can do that you may have seen people do, or you may have read some, is week notes. So a week note is a blog of your activities or experiences over the course of a week, created with a view of sharing to a wider audience. So this is another thing that you can do to work in the open and to truly be transparent about what you've been working on, what's worked, what hasn't worked, the good, the bad, the ugly, all that sort of vibe. And I wouldn't worry too much about the structure of it. I'm going to go through a couple of different structures that you can use, but it's much easier to go free reign if that's what's comfortable with you. But sometimes there's not much to say, and you can keep it short and concise, and that's fine. You're still saying something, you're still being open, and that's what matters. It can be lighthearted. You don't have to go into too much of the nitty-gritty. You can keep things high level. You can go into the nitty-gritty if you think there's an audience to read it, but then sometimes it's not all about having the audience to read it. It's about what works for you. If every week you feel like you don't have something to say, you don't have something to write about, I wouldn't treat it like a burden, because if you treat week noting like a burden, it'll start to feel like a burden. So you don't have to write about what you're working on every week. It can just be when something's happening, or at the end of a sprint, or anything like that. And I know everyone has good weeks and bad weeks, but it can also be cathartic to talk about. Maybe if you had a bad week, you can focus on the good elements, or you can focus on the bad elements. You can really shape it to whatever you want it to be, and also what message you want to convey. If it's just you're just straight up talking about what you're working on, then it's good to have the balance between what worked and what didn't work. Same to when we were talking about show and tells. A question that does come up around week noting, if anyone's read any week notes before, is it okay to kind of to name names, or to talk about people, or even mention kind of specific pieces of work? And the kind of general rule for that is not, unless you've got permission. So unless you've got permission from someone to mention someone on a piece of work, then it's best just to keep it vague. And most people can get the idea of what you're talking about from keeping it vague anyway. So often it doesn't matter. It's just you can talk about how maybe you struggled with doing a specific piece of kind of data analysis on a piece of work. You don't have to mention all the specifics about the data and the work. So in terms of different formats, I've just finished doing a year in week notes, which is something I challenged myself to do 52 different types. So I won't go into too much specifics around. I'll just give you some sort of hopefully general ideas of things that you could do to talk about what you've been working on in week notes. So you can kind of just write about your week, write about your month. Sometimes people do monthly. You can talk about what's going on, just writing it out, splitting it maybe into different themes, like this one's got well-being, or maybe even the different days. So Monday I did this, Tuesday I did this, Wednesday I did this. That's a really common way of being open and transparent with your work, and you'll be surprised the amount of people who actually will read what you're talking about and actually raise some really interesting questions. I've had some projects before where people have read week notes and they've actually joined onto the team to help out because of something that they saw as part of a piece of work through them. Another thing you can do is you can do like this one, which is a conversation. So if you maybe don't feel comfortable about doing a piece of writing all by yourself, you can do one with another person. You can support someone else. You can maybe do one as like a group of people talking about what's been going on in a piece of work, sort of like a blog, but then you maybe do it on a week basis or every 2 weeks. You can do a sketch notes, which I know Alex in my team loves doing, where you draw out what you've done that week or maybe that month. And this one takes more time than the other ones, but then it's something more visual, as people are visual learners, or if you want something you want to specifically show. I did one, so you can use different types of images as well. I did one with the Animal Crossing images talking about my week. So you could do anything like that. The kind of sky's the limit in terms of all the different methods and things that you can use. And the main thing with the show and tells and with the week notes and kind of working in open in general is kind of sharing is caring. So it's making sure that whatever you're doing, you're not doing it in isolation. You're sharing it out. So you could be sharing it out through lots of different ways. You can be putting things on Teams, Slack, Twitter, LinkedIn, Medium is where most of people I know write their week notes. Yammer, SharePoint. Just understand what's acceptable in where you work, or if there's not a sort of basis there, then find one of these that works for you, and then start encouraging other people to do it as well. So like Emily said, we've signed the digital declaration in our team, and part of that is encouraging to share our learning with others and then kind of having that two-way conversation. So you can either do it internally in your teams and places like SharePoint and the Yammer or Teams, or you can go externally in Medium and Twitter and Slack and LinkedIn and places like that. It's whatever you feel comfortable with. And the main takeaway kind of from all of this is that it would be great to kind of hear what's going on. If you could at least kind of go away, do a show and tell, or write a week note or a blog or something about what you're working on, and share it out to who you feel comfortable with, and the impact will be much bigger than you think it will. So just sort of kind of get out there and start working in the open and sharing what you've been working on.